Kelley, hey, what's going on?
Matt, not much, but thanks for having me on.
My first gotcha question, do you always match your glasses to your outfit?
No, but I'm glad that you noticed.
Yeah.
Because I'm doing something right, if you noticed.
It's really pretty epic. So we'll watch from now on. So we're like 1 month plus into the new Biden administration. And the last time we got together, I think in October, something like that, you had just written a piece for the Quincy Institute about all of the generals and neoconservatives that were lining up behind the Biden campaign, I guess disaffected Republicans primarily. And here we are, a month in, and the Biden administration has bombed Syria. Some Democrats, at least, are questioning whether or not he had the authority to do that. He's made statements about Yemen. So I want to get into what's going on. And let's start with the team. Like, does the concern that you expressed in October, has that sort of panned out in terms of who Biden is hiring for his national security team?
I think in some ways. I mean, when you think of the conservative flank, the biggest complaint that we had as, conservative restrainers under Trump was that he wasn't putting a lot of people on his team that reflected this desire to get out of endless wars and bring troops home and start, really reforming the Pentagon budget.
So John Bolton wasn't on our side?
Exactly. And now you have a Democratic president. So the biggest concern coming from, the left anti-war activists in that space are that he'll put in people who are from this sort of centrist, Democrat, hawkish foreign policy flank, and that's exactly what he's done. And so people like Tony Blinken, his Secretary of State, for example, he was around during the Obama administration and had been quite supportive of the Libya intervention, of the intervention in Yemen, Syria. He's been quoted as saying that he didn't think we did enough in Syria. And others, Jake Sullivan, who was his national security advisor, same thing. His Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, is more of a blank slate, but he's a career military officer. He's a former general who had to get a waiver just to be Secretary of Defense because he just got out within the last couple years and then went right into the defense industry. So the people he's putting in the position of national security, foreign policy, military are not coming from the Bernie Sanders wing of the party. And so there's a lot of anxiousness about how this will influence Biden's foreign policy going forward. Same with his China policy. There's been a lot of tough talk in every speech that a member of his team has made, whether it's publicly or during the confirmation hearings, calling China the pacing threat, the biggest threat, a security threat. I think William Burns, who is his CIA director nominee, had mentioned that China being the sole focus of this administration. So there really is a concern that you're shifting the deck chairs on the Titanic. You're not really going to get a drastically different foreign policy. It's just you have people with D's instead of R's behind their name.
Yeah, and like Biden infamously said, "We're back." And what I heard, and my recollection is Joe Biden as a senator has always been on the hawkish side of things. Like he and Lindsey Graham were both ideological pals and probably just pals, right?
Right. And I think there should be no surprise at what we're seeing, because you're absolutely correct. I mean, here's a guy who's been in office on Capitol Hill for 40 years. And other than some very astute things that he's said or positioned on, like the Afghanistan surge, for example. He was the lone person in the Obama administration to oppose surging tens of thousands of new troops into Afghanistan. He lost that argument. But other than that, he's been pretty much on the wrong side of every foreign policy decision post 9/11 and before. And so it's really hard to think that he was all of a sudden going to change his stripes and be some sort of restrainer and start getting us out. for example, he might start getting us, slowly extricating us out of the Middle East, but my sense is it'll be to, re-engineer the foreign policy, portfolio over to China. It's not part of any grand strategy to recalibrate our foreign policy. It'll be to just sort of, recalibrate, the resources going into another direction and keeping us involved somewhere else.
The fight over the defense secretary was about his waiver as recently being in the military, but perhaps a more concerning thing on his resume was his work as a defense contractor,
Right.
at least sitting on the board of, where did he sit? I don't remember.
That would be Raytheon.
Yeah.
And that's very interesting because you and I had this conversation about generals, the revolving door between the government and the defense industry, back and forth and back and forth. And if you take the long list of these Biden nominees and confirmees in his team, they all have ties, not all, but a substantial number of them have ties to the defense industry because, they'll go into service with the government under one president with a D after his name. And then in between times when the Republicans take over, where do they go? Most of them go into lobbying, and they lobby for defense contractors because that's what they know. They know foreign policy or national security. Or people like Michelle Flournoy, who did not get nominated, but she was on the short list. She has a firm called West Exec, and Tony Blinken was a principal in that firm, and they have a ton of corporate clients who they have been helping partner get contracts with the Pentagon. And so you have a lot of folks. So they come in with a whole set of baggage, and they are influenced by their former employers. They sit on boards. So they have an agenda that's vastly different from your agenda or mine, which is to what is, the best interest of the country. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether the best interest of the country is in mind when, they've come hot off of, one of these boards or actual employment in a place like Raytheon or Northrop Grumman or any of these top 5 defense contractors who really reap billions of dollars from the federal government every year. It's unbelievable how much what the connection is between the private sector and the government in the defense world.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of basic public choice. Even if there's nothing sinister about the revolving door, the people that come from the military and expect to go into the defense industry after they're done serving, they're thinking about where they came from and they're thinking about where they're going, and that's just human nature. And you're hardly going to ignore that when you're making decisions about whether or not we should go to war.
Right. And when you look at the former Defense Secretary, Mark Esper, he actually worked for Raytheon. And then when he came into service under the Trump administration as the top civilian official in the Pentagon, he was dealing with or overseeing some massive contracts with Raytheon. Yet Raytheon is a top 5 contractor for the federal government. And so how do you necessarily separate, your loyalty, all of your connections in your network with your past employer immediately, and when you are working in a position in the Pentagon that is dealing with contracts that are like coming up, constantly in your face. And we're talking about arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and you had people inside the Trump administration who were lobbying, pretty aggressively for Raytheon to get these contracts, and your top guy is a former employee or a lobbyist. I mean, it's really hard to see that there is not a huge influence game going on. And we are the losers. As taxpayers, we're the losers because they're not making decisions based on, the interest, the public interest, or the interest. Many times they're lobbying for weapon systems that the military doesn't even want. They say they don't want aircraft, ships, but their lobbyists are so
planes that don't fly.
Yeah, planes that don't fly. They're so pervasive in the system, and they have such intense connections with the people who work there that sometimes their interests win out over the interests of even the military itself.
Yeah, I mean to repurpose the phrase, it's a war economy.
Right.
It's an ecosystem. It feeds on itself.
Yes.
And it seems to be a perpetual motion machine that doesn't really matter if the president's a Republican or a Democrat. I'm reminded of a piece that you might remember who wrote this, but somebody at Quincy wrote a piece about the ecosystem with the think tank world.
Yes.
And how it is that all these pro-war national defense think tanks feed off of millions of dollars of money from defense contractors.
Yeah. That's an unbelievable story. And we just had another piece at Responsible Statecraft on this. The Center for New American Security is a think tank that was started as a sort of feeder organization for the future Hillary Clinton administration back in 2007. And then when it was clear she didn't get the nomination, they sort of re-engineered themselves to be a Obama feeder democratic think tank, and were very successful. And over time, they found that we're speaking the military line here. We're very supportive of the military. They're coming to our conferences. Oh, now we're getting defense contracts. Now we're getting grants and from the actual defense contractors. I mean, they were able to grow in size and influence because of this funnel of defense contracting money that's come in. And now we look at their papers and their positions, and they're all in line with this sort of expansionist military primacy, whether it be staying in Afghanistan or being tough on China and building up our military assets there. On every single overseas operation, they are for staying the course, putting more troops in, putting more assets into the region. And you have to ask, is this a response to the money that they're getting, which is very substantial, or are they getting the money because that's, they are a collection of establishment blobby, analysts and former, military officials and government officials who agree with them. And it's this chicken and the egg thing. But what we had written about was that they're not disclosing these financial interests. So they put out a paper, for example, that supported military contractors, an old paper by now, but it was military contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan, we wouldn't be able to, we wouldn't be able to complete our mission without their assistance. Well, it turns out they're getting all this money from KBR and all these places that have fielded private military contractors in the war. That's just one example. So on one hand, they could say, hey, we disclose all of our donors on this one page on our website. But when you're putting out position papers that are advocating for one weapon system over the other weapon system, or, they have corporate donors like Exxon and BP, and they're advocating to, lift the ban on crude oil distribution and in foreign industry or foreign markets, and they don't say, well, we are getting this money from Exxon, or Chevron. I mean, that's when like the viewers, the readers, the consumers of their material and their content, have to be a little wary about, well, is this a pay for play?
Right.
And I hate to pick on I don't really hate to pick on CNAS, but it's not like they're alone in this ecosystem.
Right.
We have think tanks all over Washington that get paid either by, government, defense contractors, or foreign governments, and they're pumping out literature supporting a foreign government's line. Saudi Arabia, UAE, perfect example. They flood the think tank market with money, and it's usually through other subsidiary or third parties, so you don't really know where it's coming from. And and then next thing you know, they're pumping out papers about, well, MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is really a reformer, or more in the weeds, policy stuff, where you're wondering, are they getting paid to say that, or are they getting the money because they already agree? But I think disclosure and transparency is so important, because if you're upfront about where you're getting money, then I think you'd build the trust with, your audience, that it may be, you're getting, you're seeing it's more straightforward where the influences are coming from.
Yeah. And, even if it's not pay to play, there's still so much money sloshing around the system. And I think I talked to you about this last time. I was going on Fox News Sunday, and I had to school up on tribal warfare in Syria, which at the time I knew nothing about. I still don't know that much about it. And it was very difficult to find good research for a intervention skeptical point of view. But if I wanted to defend the idea of bombing them into oblivion, there would have been endless papers. So like with so much money sloshing around, even if it's not cynical or manipulated, it's naturally going to create that ecosystem.
Right.
So which is why I'm glad you guys are around, because at the time it was just Cato, and now there's Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. That's the whole name, right?
Right, exactly.
And there's another. Where's Ed King? He's at
Defense Priorities.
Yeah.
And they're more conservative, but they are also about restraint, bringing troops home, and ending endless wars. And so they've also been great in terms of pushing back against the, establishment orthodoxy, which, that establishment orthodoxy is, it is fully entrenched, and it's really hard, to poke holes in it when you have these huge organizations like CNAS, like Heritage Foundation, or, CSIS and AEI and others, because they're so well funded and they're so interwoven into the fabric of the blob, or, I'm mixing metaphors here, but we're finding it difficult now. Right now we have a campaign to really press for Biden to bring our troops home from Afghanistan and keep to the U.S. Taliban agreement, in which the rest of the foreign troops need to be out by May 1st. And all signs are pointing to him either thwarting that deadline or finding a way around it or whatever. But he doesn't want to, it's clear he doesn't want to leave. All the signs are there. And all the think tanks that we just mentioned have all been writing these really sort of mamby-pamby, articles and papers, not exactly saying keep them there forever, but saying things like, well, we got to be careful. We have to be responsible. No hasty exits. And I'm like, wow, I've been covering this issue for the entire war, 20 years. And they're using the same jargon, the same pablum about, leaving responsibly. And it's funny that they haven't come up with new. Yeah,
if it is pay to play, at least come up with some new stuff.
But it does you do get a sense that they all snap into action.
Yeah.
And they circle the wagons. And once you've been around Washington, you could start feeling it. You start seeing the op-eds start popping up. You see the same names like David Ignatius at the Washington Post and Max Boot and on the right, and then they all fall in line because their friends are all talking about it. And so what's great about Quincy and Defense Priorities and other is that we're actually getting op-eds in the same paper saying the opposite, and they're good. They're good arguments, because I feel like we're on the right side of this issue. It's just that in the past, we just haven't had a seat at the table or been able to penetrate the blob in the media.
Yeah.
And I'm really proud that the Quincy is actually getting into New York Times and getting into some in Foreign Affairs and some of these, stodgy establishment papers, and being able to get our point of view out there. So that's a nice development, but you see them circling those wagons and you're like, wow. It's like you've seen it all before, but it's just too bad, because I think Biden is probably on fence, and he's going to probably end up wanting to please, the center right on this.
The machine, yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of the blob, last time we were talking about Trump's stated desire to get out of Afghanistan before the end of the year last year. Shockingly, it did not happen. And I was skeptical at the time. We were both hopeful. But why didn't Trump succeed at that?
I think the military obstructed him from doing it. I mean, that would be my gut. I don't have a lot of inside information, but if you remember when he lost the election and then he started firing people in the Pentagon.
Yeah, I do.
I think that
I was hopeful at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of like, wow, this is a real shakeup. I think that he knew the writing was on the wall. He wasn't going to get exactly what he wanted, but he was going to make sure he got at least down to the 2,500 that he'd sort of publicly promised. But I think that had something to do with it. I think that he was really pissed off about the way that they had obstructed his policies, and that in speaking out against him in the media. I think that, it was classic Trump. He was just sort of like, it's all payback. I don't think that he was positioning anybody for some coup like everybody thought. And I don't think he could have gotten everybody out. I think logistically, I've heard some really good arguments that we could have probably got everybody out of there in a very short time frame. And that's from people who are actually in the military and know what they're talking about, like not like me. But I think the brass found a way to just put the stop sign.
Drag their feet.
Drag their feet
Always.
just long enough.
Yeah.
And what's sad about it all is that now we have this Afghanistan study group, in which Eli Clifton, who's at the Quincy Institute, who I work with, just reported, the majority of people on this study group that gave recommendations to Congress and the president as mandated by Congress, the vast majority of these panelists have ties to the defense industry.
Right.
So they come back with recommendations saying, we can't leave precipitously. We do want to leave, but we can't leave precipitously. And by the way, we think we should increase the number of people there, or troops, to 4,500, because that's the exact number of troops we should have there to keep the peace while all these negotiations are going on. And I'm thinking 4,500 troops in a country as big as Afghanistan is like a drop in the bucket. It's not going to do anything. But this is where the establishment is on it. And it's just, so we can't even get those 2,500 out of there. I mean, I'm glad we got down to 2,500, but now it looks like it might go in the other direction. We
got to increase before we reduce.
Yeah.
Yep. I feel like that's how we do budgeting in this town.
Yeah.
So why not? So let's talk about some things that the Biden administration has done. And I mentioned this already, but we're bombing Syria.
Yeah.
And he says he was defending us. It was a defensive action. What really happened there?
I mean, I don't know exactly what happened, but it did kind of remind me of when President Trump assassinated Qasem Soleimani in Iran as retaliation, supposedly in part for the attacks that our troops were getting at these Iraqi outposts, and they were blaming them on Iranian militia. And I swear I got like a flashback to that when Biden was saying, well, these recent attacks against these Iranian-backed militias in Syria were targeted, but we're just letting them know that they can't get away with hitting our troops. I've read that, these Iranian militias, these are the same guys who probably were helping us get rid of ISIS, a few years ago. They don't want us there. We know that. They've been going tit for tat for a long time now. My question is, why are we still there?
Yeah.
We're closing in on this 17th anniversary of the Iraq invasion in late March. We can argue about the militias. Why are they there? Is there still ISIS in the region? Do we have to? My question is, why are we still there? And I think Biden is showing us that the status quo is probably going to prevail. And the saddest thing is, I don't think they really care about Iraq itself. I think there are forces within the military establishment that are very keen on staying in that northern Iraq, Syria border area and rooting out the remnants of ISIS, and they don't want to cede any control. They've been working there with the Kurds, and so they're probably really forcefully lobbying to stay there. And Brett McGurk, who was one of Trump's envoys in Syria, is now been rehired under Biden. So likelihood is he's not going to advocate for getting out of Syria. I don't even know how many guys and gals we have in Syria because they won't tell us. So I just get a sense that, one, we're not going anywhere. And two, I think Biden seems to have the same mindset as every other president, that we got to show Iran that we're tough. We're not taking any guff from them. This is just the same cycle of on one side of your mouth, you're saying, I want to open up relations. We want to get back into this nuclear deal. On the other, we're going to show them who's boss, and we're not going to let them, swagger around the region. And I think that's just like a dysfunctional cycle that has gotten us nowhere in 20 years. And nobody asked the question, why are we still there? Why is it an American security interest that we still have troops in northern Iraq taking fire?
And politically, it's impossible to believe that the Iranian government would say, okay, I'm sorry, we're going to stop this.
Yeah.
So like you say, it's a cycle that never ends, because they hit, we hit, they hit, we hit. And it never ends, and it feeds the machine. I was happy to see that at least several Senate Democrats raised the whole question of whether or not the Biden administration had the authority to do this. And I would love to see, I didn't see anything from Nancy Pelosi, who was adamant that the Trump administration needed congressional authorization to bomb Syria, but I haven't seen her talk about this. So there's partisanship, but at least some Democrats are being consistent and saying, we challenged Trump when he did it. Now we're challenging Biden. The last AUMF was 2002. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, you had the 2001 for the Afghanistan operation, and then you had the 2002 for the Iraq, and then an associated forces, which has allowed them a blank check to just go after anybody in the region and use the AUMF, either one or two, to justify it.
Such an abdication of congressional responsibility. Is there any hope that there is a coalition of Republicans and Democrats that will insist on authorization to continue bombing Syria?
Yeah, I mean, we saw it in the last Congress. I mean, there's a really strong coalition. There's a war powers caucus in the House made up of Republicans and Democrats. I think Tom Massey's on there, Barbara Lee, who's been really on the forefront, Democrat from California, on initiating these repeal the one in 2001, 2002 AUMFs. I mean, they've introduced several bills over the last several years. So you have the infrastructure left and right to fight it. I think it exists in the Senate too, with Rand Paul and Mike Lee, and I believe Chris Murphy and Bernie Sanders. They've just been, unfortunately, unsuccessful. I think they passed in the House, but not the Senate. And so I from what I hear, that there's going to be another shot at this, and Barbara Lee, I think, is either introduced new legislation or is about to. Unfortunately, I mean, the Senate's going to be hard. I think that's where the real fault line is. You have some really great Republicans on this issue, but not enough to sway all those hawks. And it was very heartening to see, these members of Congress weighing in, with statements after the Syria bombing. But what can they do? I mean, they've gone right up to the line on challenging with war powers, the War Powers Act in regards to Yemen. That was vetoed by Trump. Let's see if maybe they can pass something this time, and maybe Biden will be more inclined to sign something. But it's really going to have to come from Congress and from the American people. Like, people have to start pressing their members to do something.
Perhaps the Yemen resolution is a more fruitful path forward. Although I worry about the partisan instincts of the Speaker of the House, and there has to be, I don't know, you will know this better than me, but the statement, I guess it was an executive order made by the Biden administration regarding assisting Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen. I think it's shocking that arrangement exists in the first place. But it wasn't clear that it meant anything because it was about, I forget the right word, but it was like they will no longer assist in Saudi Arabia aggressing.
Right.
But if it's defensive, we're still going to help.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of mixed messages coming out from the Biden administration on foreign policy, and that was like the biggest one, where you're right. He said we are no longer going to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia for its offensive operations in Yemen, but then we will maintain our defense. We will continue to help Saudi Arabia defend itself against Iran, whether it be their sovereign territory or their region. I forget how he exactly put it, but yeah, he hasn't been very clear about what offensive operations mean. And really, I mean, if Saudi Arabia, say, is attacked by the Houthis, who we have said are backed by Iran, does that count? Do we assist them in retaliating? Do we allow them to use weapons, that we send them to go after the Houthis? So I think there hasn't been a lot of clarity on that, but that sort of leaves the door open for Biden to continue, this special relationship what we have with Saudi Arabia. And I think a lot of people have been fighting against these arms sales are a little, I mean, they're hopeful, but I think they need to hear exactly what he meant. And will the Saudis in the defense industry find a loophole in which we can still, end up sending billions of dollars worth of U.S.-made weaponry over there, but skirting this whole Yemen declaration. I mean, I know Ro Khanna and other people and Rand Paul as well, have been really strong on getting us out of this war in Yemen. And I think the Biden administration has been very clear that they want to see an end to it. But I think that the tension is, getting out of that war, but having the pressure from the defense industry and all the other interests in keeping the weapons pipeline open to whether it be Saudi or UAE, these other Gulf states. I mean, it's such a lucrative business. And I believe at Quincy that until we turn that spigot off, we are going to be entrenched in that region, because on one hand, you'll hear people say, well, we'll give them the weapons to defend themselves and to secure their own region. But if we keep giving them weapons and we have this pipeline, that means we help in the maintenance, the production, a lot of times the training on how to use them. I mean, it's not this clear cut like, oh, we'll give them some planes and some bombs and then we're out of here. It is a relationship that's forged through those sales. And I think we have to turn that spigot off, and we have to start extricating from the region, because right now they're happy. They're getting our weapons. They have this tacit, or if not explicit, agreements to defend them. Same with Israel. As long as we're there, keeping everything going, they can do whatever they want. And that means being more aggressive whether it be in Yemen or against Iran. So I feel like the sooner we get out of there and let them handle their own business, the better.
Yeah, it's this ongoing dilemma because my read of what the Biden statement meant was kind of a hat tip to progressive activists that have been banging this drum about the human devastation caused by American bombs in Yemen.
And the Obama administration for getting into it in the first place.
Yeah, and it seemed like they're at least acknowledging that there's a lot of grassroots pressure from their base to do that. But I feel like the American people have been pretty clear on things like Afghanistan. I feel like across the board, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, certainly Libertarians want us out. And yet, Obama runs against permanent war, gets us into more permanent war.
Yep.
Trump runs against permanent war. And, his defenders would say he didn't get us into any new wars, but he sort of flirted with the idea.
Yeah.
And now Biden, I don't recall him running on bombing Syria. Was that like one of his slogans?
They stayed so far away from Syria, you would think it didn't even exist. I mean, it just doesn't come up, which is it's so what's the word? I'm flummoxed by it all because we've actually poured a lot of money and investment in that, whether it be with the actual troops we have on the ground that we still don't know the number of which, but we've been bombing there. We've had drone attacks. It's all interconnected with our relationships with Russia and Turkey and the rest of the Middle East. I mean, it's a big deal. I mean, we spent much of the Obama administration calling for regime change and getting, taking Bashar Assad out. And then this election, you don't hear a word of it.
Yeah.
And I get a little nervous because I feel like with the comment that I mentioned from Tony Blinken, who said that he felt like we didn't do enough there. And then you have a whole right-wing contingent who feel like that we should still be fighting in there. The Hillary Clinton, the Clintonites of the past were always pretty. They were chomping on the bit to start bombing. And I remember Hillary Clinton's friend Mark Morell, one of her compatriots, is saying, well, if Russia gets in the way, let's bomb them too. I mean, so there's been interest on both sides to stay in that war, to get rid of Bashar Assad. And I feel like almost like the unmentioning, like it being so quiet that we might wake up tomorrow and the Biden administration is like, okay, we're going to take Bashar Assad out, or we're going back in there to root ISIS out, which, so it's unclear, and I feel like it's been not addressed fully, let's just say.
It's kind of shocking. So you have this contradiction where the American people clearly want something, and the political system doesn't seem to deliver it. But what happened with this bombing, which in a very different way than the press's reaction to Trump's, was almost nothing. There was very little acknowledgement, let alone critical discussion of whether or not Biden had the authority to do this. Did he talk about this? Is this like a contradiction of his campaign promises? There's just silence. It's almost silence, right? I mean, I could go read what Glenn Greenwald has to say, but he's hardly mainstream media.
It's actually very disappointing and sad because it's almost like people are so inured to the fact that we're bombing sovereign countries all the time that they don't even blink an eye. And the fact that we were bombing Iranians or Iranian-backed militias in Syria that had hit us in Iraq, people don't realize how silly, or not silly, but how strange that sounds, that we are dealing with all of these proxy issues. We're dealing with militias that people didn't even know they exist. We're using our military hardware like a hammer on little nails whether it be in Syria, which we have no business being in, or Iraq, which I would argue we don't have business being in, against Iran, who, we haven't declared war against. So I feel like because after 9/11, we got so used to this sort of, the military solution to every problem overseas, that it just goes in one year and out the other. I think when Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, was assassinated last year, I think that rose to the level of consciousness because, wow, we actually took somebody out. Trump's bragging about it. Pompeo's bragging about it. The military's justifying it. I think that sort of like permeated our consciousness, like what's going on over there. But as far as these targeted bombings, I mean, people have like, yeah, been there, done that. And that scares me. Yeah. Because I feel like we've been doing that for 20 years. We've been dropping bombs on sovereign nations. And when asked, they'll say, oh, well, this is justified under the 2001 AUMF or the 2002 AUMF because the fine print says associated, groups, and that we're there to root out ISIS, and that qualified, and so people go, okay, I guess you're right, and we move on, and that bothers me.
I was thinking about this in the context of the old Republican Party. I'm old enough to remember when the Republican Party was for balanced budgets and fiscal responsibility. It seems like an ancient thing now, but the Achilles heel when the Mike Lees and the Rand Pauls of the world were trying to balance the budget in 2010, 2012, 2014 was the defense budget. And ultimately, all of those efforts unraveled because not because Democrats couldn't stomach limits on domestic spending, but because Republicans couldn't stomach any restraint in the defense budget. And fully funding all of these never-ending wars is a black hole. Like, there's never enough.
Never enough.
There can't be enough. And so it strikes me that we need to probably bring fiscal responsibility back into the conversation, because now like we're about to spend 1.9 trillion. Nobody actually knows what's in that bill, but there's a lot for everybody and everything, except perhaps maybe the poor people that have been forced out of their jobs because of lockdowns. But it all starts and ends with a willingness to rein in defense.
Yeah.
And you can't rein in a defense budget if you don't have a restrained foreign policy, because it's a black hole.
Right. Right. And I feel like, people who have been advocating for, clawing back the defense budget have been kind of working it at the wrong angle. I think most Americans are like, well, if we need to have, X number of submarines and ships in the South China Sea, or ships in, the Gulf, Persian Gulf, and, the NATO here, and, then my tax dollars are going to a good place because I feel safe, and my congressman or congresswoman is telling me that this is necessary for my security and safety. I think we need to start arguing, is that ship making us safe? Having this extra ship, or having this extra submarine, or having these F-35s, or these troops over here, does that make us safer? Is that part of a strategy that works? Is that in the best interest of the United States? And I think we have smart people, where I work at Quincy and other places, that can start tackling this and start pushing back on the strategy. So let's have a budget that matches smart strategy. And if you can convince people that, no, those troops over there in Saudi Arabia are not making you safer. It is not a United States security interest for those troops to be there, because really they're just stationed there to make Saudi Arabia feel better in their fight with Iran. And their military sucks. So we are doing all the fighting for them, and we're equipping them. Is that in the best interest of the United States, the taxpayer, or the troops that are going over there and their military families back home that are missing their dad or mom? Is that in the best? I think that's the way you get to people when you say this is not in our interest.
Yeah.
It might be in Saudi, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's interest that we have like 17,000 troops over there stationed at bases because, they can't defend themselves. But they're never going to be able to defend ourselves if we keep doing it for them. And the same with Europe. I mean, that's another whole other story. Taking a look at NATO and taking a look at the troops we have stationed in Europe. Are these security alliances in our best interest anymore? Can Europe start taking these security burdens on themselves? I'm thinking they want to. I'm listening to, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, at the NATO meeting 2 weeks ago. He was like, you know what? We got to start taking care of our own neighborhood. And I'm like, yeah. And I think that when we strip everything away, I think Europeans actually don't want us there. I think that they're happy to work with us on certain issues, but they certainly don't want a security alliance against China, which Biden has brought up. And I think they don't want to keep poking Russia either. I don't think that they feel like expanding NATO is in their best interest, for example, or putting more troops on the border or Russia's borders is the best answer. And I think looking at those strategies in a 21st century context and then saying, do we really want to pay for this? I think that's the best way to go at, because when you start just saying we want to take 2% off the budget and we want to strip this program or take people start either they glaze over or they think you're just taking big pair of scissors and that you really don't care about.
It's an abstraction and it's like
right.
Pencil pushing. But so there's that argument that money is not necessary. It'd be better spent back home, which is the argument you're making.
Yeah.
Because what we're doing over there is not making us safer. There's a more extreme version of that argument that says it's making us less safe,
right.
Sort of the Ron Paul blowback kind of thing. Which argument is more effective, or are they both ways to get the American people to pay more attention?
I think there's both ways. I think the American people are pretty smart and savvy, and if you exaggerate too much and say we're not needed anywhere, then that hints of some sort of isolation. Or if you say, any presence is gonna receive any blowback, or I feel like if you approach this strategically, well, you can take China for example, and we have and I keep bragging about Quincy, but I mean they're not advocating to get out of Asia and just take all of our military assets and leave. They actually have a pretty good proposal or a plan in which we would have a presence, but start helping our allies in the region help themselves, like be porcupines, so that they can keep their relationships open with China, because there's a lot of trading and economic interest there, but be ready to defend themselves if need be. And if we can help them do that, that'd be great. And keep enough of our assets there so that we keep the channels, like the trade channels, open, and give our allies, some sense that we're there and in the free navigatory channels, not, being aggressive like we are now. If you do that, you can start shaving off your budget, maybe some of the ships, some of the submarines, or place them elsewhere where they might be needed. Bring some troops home that are just instigating, or shift them elsewhere. But I think when you make those arguments that you're not calling for all or nothing, but that you're trying to be strategic, and in the process of being strategic, you might be able to sort of eliminate some programs, eliminate some fat. How about not building some of the ships that the military says we don't want? So I think there are ways of approaching this where the consumer, or your audience rather, doesn't think that you're just purely ideological, but you're trying to reshape foreign policy to just be more realistic.
Yeah. So what you're advocating, as I understand it, is responsible statecraft.
Yes.
Very on brand. Thanks for doing this again. And hopefully next time, let's talk about something awesome and positive that's happened. But how do we find you and Quincy online?
Okay, so Quincy Institute, the think tank website is www.quincyinst.org. And then I'm also an editor at Responsible Statecraft, which is our online magazine affiliated with the think tank, and that's at responsiblestatecraft.org.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
That was amazing. Where can I get more content just like that? It's a great question. You're clearly a discerning consumer of the best content. Make sure to like the video, subscribe, and click the bell. And if you're consuming podcasts, go to Apple, Stitcher, anywhere you get them. I'm in. Kibbe on Liberty, honest conversations with interesting people.